Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here as always with Walter Russell Mead of Tablet, the Wall Street Journal, Hudson Institute, and the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. The U.S. has cut off intelligence sharing with Kyiv in a move that could seriously hamper the Ukrainian military's ability to target Russian forces, according to the Financial Times. The step follows the decision earlier this week by the Trump administration to suspend military aid deliveries to Ukraine and comes after a dramatic breakdown in relations between the U.S. president and Ukraine's leader, Volodymyr Zelensky. U.S. intelligence cooperation has been essential for Ukraine's ability to identify and strike Russian military targets. Walter, is this news or faux news?
Well, in one sense, it clearly is news because the article understates the story in a way. This is not something that could limit Ukraine's ability to target Russian troops. It is something that does significantly impact Ukraine's ability to do this. And it does change the situation on the field. So in that sense, it's real news. It's happening. But then we think about how long will it last, given President Trump's, let's just say, flexibility on some of these issues. I see we're doing this one on Friday morning. And I see that already there's a story that Trump may be stepping up sanctions on Russia because he's perceiving that Putin is dragging his feet on ceasefire negotiations. So in that sense, what Trump is doing is he wants a deal in Ukraine. He wants the deal more than he cares about what's in the deal. In his idea, the American interest is for the war to stop and for us to be able to have a business-like relationship with Russia. You can argue with that. You can say it's immoral, cynical, whatever, or misguided calculation. All those things you can say, but this is what he wants and what he's trying to get. And if he sees Ukraine dragging its feet, he will put pressure on Ukraine. If he sees Putin dragging his feet, he will try, and it will be harder for Putin than Ukraine, because Ukraine is much more dependent on the U.S. than Russia is. He will try to press Russia. So in that sense, it's kind of, it's sort of, it's less important than it looks because it's part of a process that we can clearly understand. So I would put it there. There is a news element there, but we should not be distracted by this one piece of information from following the larger story of which it's a part.
One of the things you mentioned earlier this week was that part of what Trump hates so much about the war and why he's kind of desperate for it to end is that it splits his own coalition at home, with support for Ukraine being broadly popular among Republican lawmakers and voters, but hugely unpopular among the kind of hardline MAGA base. Which side of that split do you think Trump is, in the end, probably going to have to disappoint by forcing a compromise with the other? Or does that depend on external events?
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump does not have a specific end point in mind. What will be the terms of a peace? Where will the boundary be? Or even, what he will be trying to do is focus on getting the war to stop, which he thinks if he does that, then maybe some MAGA people will grumble that he didn't do enough, and plenty of Ukraine people will scream that he didn't do enough. But he will probably think that stopping the war is going to satisfy enough people on both sides I think that goal will remain uppermost in his mind.
All right, our second story. Senior State Department officials have drawn up plans to close a dozen consulates overseas by this summer and are considering shutting down many more missions. The department also plans to lay off many local citizens who work for its hundreds of missions. Those workers make up 2/3 of the agency's workforce, and according to the New York Times, in many countries they form the foundation of U.S. diplomats' knowledge of their environments. The moves come at a time when China has overtaken the United States in the number of global diplomatic outposts. Walter, news or faux news?
I would have to come down on the faux news side here. First of all, because I'm old enough to have lived through many, many State Department attempted restructurings before. And I think Hillary Clinton was trying to reduce posts in Europe and increase posts in other parts of the world as part of the pivot, the eternal pivot to Asia. And certainly the Bush administration had the same things in mind. The State Department is a very, very change averse institution. And you've got a lot of Sir Humphrey Appleby's in there that are just very, very good at playing yes minister. So, and you, if you look at that story in the New York Times that you're quoting from, it's got fingerprints of leaking State Department people all over it. The State Department is the greatest, most sophisticated source of leaks, mass source. I would say there are people in the intelligence community who are like individuals who are really better at leaking, really, really good at playing that game. But the State Department has more participants in the leak game than anybody else. And they don't want the consulate in Florence to close. And I visited that consulate. I visited dozens of consulates and embassies around the world. And you know what? If somebody offered me the job of U.S. consul in Florence for 3 years, I just might consider accepting. Terrible, on a busy weekend, a bunch of American college students get drunk and some of them get arrested or in bar fights or whatever, and you have to go down and see the local chief of police and see what you can do about sort of getting them out on bail or something, right? It's serious responsibility. I would take that job in a heartbeat. And I would certainly rather be the American consul in Florence than the American consul in Peshawar, where I've also visited the consulate and where those people have had a lot, live with a lot of danger every day and do really hard work. I would say in general, we do need fewer consulates in Europe. We have three, I think, ambassadors in Rome, an ambassador to the Vatican, an ambassador to Italy, and an ambassador to, what is it, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations.
Right. We have three in Brussels as well, I think. NATO, EU, and Belgium.
Right. I mean, it occurs to me that, like, well, NATO, I think, makes sense to be in Brussels, but maybe the Food and Agricultural Organization should be in, I don't know, Nairobi rather than Rome. But I don't think you'd ever get a vote of the staff wanting to move it. So this needs some of these things really need to happen, and the State Department institutionally will fight them tooth and nail. I mean, even though I will say, even in the list that we saw in the piece, some of those consulates I actually think are important, like the one in Hamburg. Anybody who remembers 911 and some of the things that happened, Hamburg was a really important place, and I suspect that we still do a lot of very interesting things in that consulate. So, no list is going to be exactly right or totally wrong. So that part is right. Now, I do see that we're seeing stories today that President Trump is saying, well, we should do these cuts, but we should do them with a scalpel, not a chainsaw. I would definitely say the State Department is a place where you need the scalpel. You need a stern scalpel. But also, I guess I don't think that the goal should be fewer posts or fewer career employees. I think different posts and different sets of responsibilities and sort of incentives for employees, I think would be very important. But overall, and the question of laying off foreign workers, that's a tricky one. I have certainly been, and I'm sure, Jeremy, in your experience, you've been to places around the world where those foreign workers really are important. But it is also true that in some areas, their loyalties aren't 100% aligned, or their incentives aren't 100% aligned with those of the United States. And it can be something as simple as just a certain political clique gets involved there, or in some cases, a very, very vigilant government makes sure. So, but this would actually argue for a larger American foreign service if you were going to have fewer foreign employees in some of these places. One of the reasons we hire them actually is budgetary reasons. We often pay them less than we would pay American workers doing those jobs, which, if you think about it, doesn't really harmonize with Trump's America First approach. So diplomacy is changing. And I should say, with all of these things that I'm saying, I'm on some kind of congressionally set up committee for modernization of the State Department. So let me just say here, we haven't actually met. And with everything that is going on in Washington, who knows when that's all going to come together. But I should definitely say, I'm not speaking here in any official capacity, whatever. And I very much have an open mind about all of these questions. I do think that we need to reconfigure the State Department. I don't think that we need to necessarily shrink it, though I am open. People have some good ideas, ways to apply the scalpel, fine. But we don't have, you go to places like India, Indonesia, there are a lot of places that are really important to American foreign policy, to the economic, political, and security future of our country, where we simply don't have the ability to know what's going on. I'll just mention the city of Lucknow, which is the capital of the largest state by population in India. And obviously, regular listeners to the podcast know I've gotten interested in India in the last few years. And people the political leadership of Lucknow is actually very important to what happens in New Delhi, and matters a lot in terms of what is our Indo-Pacific strategy going to be. And you'll find that local politicians there often have very little idea, really, of how Americans think about this, or how American policy, to whether it's toward China, toward India, or anything else, evolves. So we're underrepresented in some really important parts of the world, and I think we are somewhat overrepresented in some others. I think you mentioned the contrast once between, we had a very small consular presence in Leipzig, which is a city in former East Germany that is really critical in terms of, it's a place where the AfD is very strong, where a lot of the sort of where Russia is very active in all kinds of ways. But we have very large presence in a city like Dusseldorf, which, let's not say anything about the glamorous city of Dusseldorf or its diligent and useful inhabitants, but is less a hotbed of intrigue or anything else that the American government needs to be concerned with.
Yeah, one other thing I remember from working at the embassy is, those hundreds of local German employees of the State Department. They're employees of the US government, but they're subject to German labor law. So they're entitled to like 6 months of sick leave per year or something, which certainly wouldn't be the case in Lucknow or Peshawar, Nairobi, or some of the other places we could reallocate some resources.
Yeah, they would, the resources would go farther. Again, though, with diplomacy, like with the military, you should not judge what you spend by whether X is a bargain and Y isn't. You have to look at, what do you need? And this, to me, is where the slogan America First would actually make sense. Look at our footprint of representation around the world in the light of our real national interests, and put your resources, your effort, your talent, your focus on the places that matter the most.
All right, final story of the week. The Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company plans to invest at least $100 billion more in chip manufacturing plants in the U.S. over the next several years, under a plan announced this week by the company and President Trump. TSMC plans to use the funds to add to its chip manufacturing in Arizona. It will construct 3 new chip plants, 2 chip packaging plants, and a research and development center, the company's chief executive said during a White House appearance with the president. Such an expansion would advance a long-pursued U.S. goal to revive the domestic semiconductor industry after manufacturing fled largely to Asian countries in recent decades. Walter, news or faux news?
I'd say it's news, and good news. Often when people do things, they have more than one good reason for doing it. And if I were hypothetically the executive of a chip manufacturing company in Taiwan that, was a world leader in the industry, I would see something like this as accomplishing several goals for me. Number one, it definitely keeps Donald Trump happy. And if you are Taiwanese and you would prefer not to see either a war in the Taiwan Strait or an occupation of Taiwan by China, then this is a really good idea. And this is an excellent time to do it. And it's a big number. Arizona is a swing state. It's a it's a smart move all around. And by the way, Arizona, with its very dry climate, is a place where it's sort of logical that there would be some chip manufacturing there. So all makes sense. But also, if suppose just hypothetically I had some doubts about America's long-term commitment and I was a Taiwanese chip manufacturer, I might want to make sure that my company would survive and flourish whatever happens on Taiwan. So this is both an insurance policy against America failing to help keep Taiwan independent and a way of making the insurance policy look a little bit stronger, paying a premium on the insurance policy. So it's hedging in two different ways. It's a very interesting move, and it does, I think, suggest that the idea that everything that Trump is doing is incompetent and none of it is bringing any benefits, that is overstated. Here, I think, is a very concrete example of an actual benefit to the United States and to Taiwan, frankly, of the Trump stance.
All right, that does it for this week's news. Let's have the big conversation. So, two different stories in the Journal this week, Walter, both about tariffs and trade that I thought might be a good way into the issue as a whole. So first, after hitting Canada and Mexico with 25% tariffs, Trump partially pulled them back this week after markets sank and some apparent lobbying efforts from American firms and some fears of a recession began to surface, although many other tariffs on our neighbors, some as high as 40%, remain, at least for now, which Trump says are aimed at getting both to enforce their borders with the U.S. So that was one story. And then the other story was about China's apparent quiet panic about Trump's trade and tariff policies. He added to existing tariffs on China this week, citing its role in the fentanyl crisis in the US, and also notched an apparent, or at least symbolic, victory in getting a consortium of US investors to buy majority stakes in ports on both ends of the Panama Canal. According to the Journal, officials in Beijing see Trump as possibly successfully rewiring the global trading system that has pulled China out of poverty and which Beijing thought it was on course to take over from Washington. So I know there are a lot of different issues there, but I'd love to step back and get your take on the administration's trade and tariff policy more generally, insofar as there's a consistent one, and how effective you think it could be in, let's say, the best case scenario for solving the various domestic and international challenges that Trump has identified.
I mean, I think you can see sort of simultaneously here the strengths and the weaknesses that we often see in Trump's approach to international affairs. I would say that the weakness we see that, the tariffs are on, the tariffs are off. I think, Trump sees this as, his style is very much whatever we said yesterday is renegotiable today. And that it does have advantages. I mean, it's not a stupid thing to do, but in international affairs, as even in business, sometimes it is worth maintaining a long-term relationship, even if there's a certain cost. And I talked to a number of businessmen in New York back in 2015, 16, when Trump was first appearing. And what a lot of them said to me is, yeah, I did business with Trump. I wouldn't do it again because he keeps changing the rules and so on and so forth. And so over time, if you if you announce tariff X and then the next day you reduce it 10%, the next day you raise it 20%, and the next day you make it 40% part and 0%, after a while you lose credibility and there's less motivation. In the beginning, there's more motivation for people to make a deal. You say, I'm going to put tariff on you 40% unless you help me. Okay, fine, I'll help you. But then if I do this and then next week you're back at me again, at a certain point, I just think of you as noise, and that there's nothing I can do that will change the fact that I'm getting a lot of, uncertainty and bad vibrations and other things from you. So you're the wind that's blowing, and I just have to adapt to it. And that I think may be beginning to set in on some of these trade issues, particularly, by the way, for in this hemisphere where you have Mexico and Canada already in the first Trump term redid NAFTA to Trump specifications. So USMC is not some like evil Bill Clinton or George H.W. Bush deal that Trump is coming in and saying this doesn't work and I need to change it. This is a Trump deal that Trump is saying, wait a minute, this wasn't good enough, whatever. That's a mistake, I think. Maybe the mistake was his original USMC didn't include enough stuff, but to sort of make a solemn deal, get it passed by Congress, then start saying, well, we got to shake up this or that piece of that deal. Then saying, okay, well, no, with the deal, I'll give you an extra month because we had this deal. It just all accelerates the process of ultimately losing credibility rather than gaining it. Now, all of that said, I don't consider myself a better businessman than Donald Trump, and I would not try to get into some kind of corporate bidding war or something with him. I'll stick to my field, where alas, the material rewards are less. So there's an area I think where we're seeing some weakness that's likely to continue until and unless people get the sense that, all right, if I get a deal, I have a deal. At which point you can start really pushing for a real deal. But they have to believe that when you sign the paper and they sign the paper and shake hands, it's done. It's done. Then, but we're also seeing again, and this is not untypical in Trump world, sort of messy failures, chaos, contradiction in one part of the scene, but then at another, sort of unexpected developments that look favorable that maybe we wouldn't have gotten another way. So the fact that China's afraid that Trump has a strategy that's working is pretty counter to the sort of conventional narrative of Trump the idiot, Trump who can do nothing. The people who are watching most closely and have the biggest stake are actually afraid that this thing might be working. That should, for the rest of us, give us a little bit of caution before we try to write off the whole Trump story. Now, here, I do think that part of what's going on is that it's not necessarily that Trump is a strategic genius here. He may well be, but the problem is that China's position is weak for reasons that have everything to do with China and Chinese strategy and very little to do, if anything, with the United States. So what do I mean by that? China remains, after all these years, committed to an export-led growth strategy. That is, for the Chinese economy to keep humming along, China needs other people around the world to buy more, not only just buy a greater volume of Chinese products, but to start buying a greater variety of Chinese products. So it's no longer enough for China to just sell like very low-end products or even standard consumer products like phones or whatever those things may be. But China needs to get up, and it doesn't want to import capital goods anymore, machines that make machines. It wants to export those. It doesn't want to import cars. It wants to export cars. And so what that does, and it wants to export jet planes and it wants to export computer chips. There's nothing that China that, and the more sophisticated it is, the more government money and the more subsidies, the more policy support they're ready to throw at it. So what that does is it makes China a threat to the economies of virtually every other country on the planet. So again, the Europeans are furious with the Trump administration. The sort of indescribable loathing that they had for the first Trump administration is only a small portion of the loathing and disgust they have for Trump 2.0. This is the worst nightmare imaginable. And it's the most obvious move in the world to say, well, America, if you're not going to be nice to us, we will spite you like you've never been spited. We know you worry about China more than anything else in the world, so we're going to help China and blah, right? That's the obvious move, the sort of Machiavelli 101, right? But here's the problem. What does China want? It wants to destroy European industry. Literally, it wants to take over that business. It is a direct threat to the survival of the German social model, the French social model, the Italian social model. So China's own commitment to a development strategy puts China in a profoundly weak position vis-a-vis the United States when it comes to the diplomacy of trade. And this is not, the problem is not that Chinese economists are intellectually committed to a set of ideas about export-led trade. And so if they could just change these ideas, then China could change strategy and flip everything. It's that huge chunks of Chinese capital, Chinese workers, bank loans, local government revenues, et cetera, are tied to this development model. And you can't unpick it quickly. Worse, the domestic parts of the Chinese, the biggest domestic success in some ways they've had is the housing market, which is now this huge real estate bubble. And so they're looking, you might normally look to try to stimulate your domestic economy as a way to offset trade problems, but China is actually trying to deal with the sort of hangover of a massive overstimulation of real estate, decades long. In some ways, I think the news story that you're linking to gave America too much credit for crafting a trap that, like so many other things in our world today, was actually made in China, not made in the USA. It's an export, not an import. But I do think that the Trump administration's calculations on trade are to some degree informed by their understanding that China has kind of worked itself into a dead end. Honestly, Xi Jinping has a very, very tough set of choices in front of him. It's not that easy. I would never underestimate the ability of Chinese policymakers to manage difficult problems and find solutions. These are very intelligent people who think very hard about their problems, who care immensely about the development and the sort of rise of the Chinese economy, Chinese social values, all of these. They really do care about it. And they've got the full resources of a very wealthy state behind them. So we should never just say, oh my goodness, those Chinese, they've totally messed up. There's nothing they can do. Ha ha ha. We'll just wait for their inevitable decline. It is not that simple by any means, nor is it clear to me, by the way, that a declining China would be a better co-tenant of the planet than a rising one. That's a whole another set of issues. But right now, the Chinese are in a bit of a fix, and the United States under Trump seems to be looking for ways to exploit that predicament.
Speaking of that, one final question. The Journal report also noted that apparently some officials in Beijing see Trump as, his attempts to resolve the war in Ukraine, his attempts to resolve the conflict in the Middle East, as being kind of attempts to park Russia, park the Middle East and Iran to focus on China, which sounds a lot like what we've talked about in previous episodes of the approach that the Biden administration thought it was taking at the beginning, maybe the Obama administration too. Do you see that as being a factor in Trump's strategy? And if so, do you think he has any kind of better shot at success?
I do think that Trump, very much like Biden and very much like Obama, wants to park Russia, sidestep Iran, just sort of take Iran off the table as a problem, and then sort of deal with China, which doesn't necessarily mean by any means going to war with China or anything like that, but from a position of strength, having a good long talk with Xi Jinping about how can the two of us cooperate in this changing world. Does he have a better chance? Well, I think the Biden-Obama policy had zero chance. So I don't think you can have less chance. I think that, the policy of splitting the difference, the policy of waffling, the policy of trying to hope that a strong Iran would be a stable partner for you in the Middle East, some of these things were really non-starters. And also the idea that you can park Russia while trying to wage ideological war against it is a tricky proposition, one that I don't think either the Biden or the Obama people were capable of managing. So I think the Trump chance so far, I would not say yet that Trump's strategy has zero chance of success. So he's in better shape. Again, let's look at something. The biggest change in the geopolitical situation between, say, 24 months ago and now is that Israel has kicked Iran really hard into a corner with the help of the Biden administration. Again, the one great success of Biden era foreign policy was supporting Israel, sometimes holding its nose, but supporting Israel enough so that Israel ends up clearly the victor in the struggle with Iran. Hamas, it's a little bit more complicated, and the end game is tricky. Even Hezbollah, there are problems, but Iran was clearly the loser in that encounter. So that has tilted the balance in the Middle East, opened a whole new set of possibilities, and is a sobering factor for Russia, which, of course, has lost its position in Syria. All of that gives Trump more cards to play than Biden people had. In a second term, would they have played some of these effectively? One can't say. Well, there wouldn't have been a second Biden term. So, yes, I think we're in a better position now. And I do think the Biden people deserve some credit for doing this. And they did it, again, to be fair, against the sentiment of a lot of their party. And the Democrats paid a political price for this in the last election. Though I think by holding their nose so much and talking to everybody about how much they were holding their nose about Israel and how regrettable it is and what terrible things they're doing, and we wish they would stop, they sort of ended up not reaping the rewards on the pro-Israel side for the actual support that they provided, while the support that they provided was enough to deeply antagonize the anti-Israel side without them getting a payoff for what was seen rightly as empty, hypocritical rhetoric. So, the political management of foreign policy remains a big part of the game.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. Another reader request this week, Walter, this one from Tom in Fort Worth, who wants to know, quote, what company are you most loyal to? I assume Tom means as a consumer. Saudi Aramco.
Well, this is probably going to get a lot of suspicion of product placement here, and I only wish there was some huge product placement scandal brewing about all the money that we're making here at what really matters. But probably Cherry Coke Zero is one of my great consumer addictions. So I'd have to definitely, and since, being from the South, Coca-Cola was the product then. And I'd say if there's a challenger to Coke, it's probably Apple, as so much of my life is in the Apple sphere. So, Tim Cook, Coca-Cola, if you guys are interested in sponsoring a Hungry podcast, y'all just come right on down and we will work with you to the best of our ability.
We're open for business. All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.